Okay, welcome back. Now we have just finished creating this ammo count widget BP, and it's got all these elements that will show us information regarding the ammo of our currently equipped weapon. And now we'd like to display this to the screen. Now we've already seen one way of displaying a HUD to the screen, and that's through our shooter HUD BP. This is a blueprint of the HUD class. And this uses blueprint nodes to draw textures to the screen. I'm just opening this to show you that we end up calling this draw texture blueprint function, and that draws our crosshairs to the screen. We'll go ahead and let shooter HUD BP handle the crosshairs, but we're going to draw this HUD to the screen using our player controller class, and we're going to do this from C++. So this way you'll know two different ways to draw HUDs to the screen. Now we're going to create our own custom player controller class, and we're going to add the HUD functionality to that class. So let's create a new C++ class. Let's go down to our C++ classes shooter folder, right click and new C++ class, and we're going to create a player controller. So select player controller, that's going to be the base class we're inheriting from, and we're going to call this shooter player controller. So here we have shooter player controller. Let's go ahead and click on create class. So here we have the shooter player controller.h, and it's pretty much empty. And what we'd like to do is add a public section so we can have a constructor. So let's make our constructor. It's going to be a shooter player controller. So there's our constructor, and we can go ahead and create a definition for this constructor in the CPP file. So here's our CPP file. I'm going to paste in the A shooter player controller, but I do need to fully qualify its name using the scope resolution operator, and I'll give this a body. Perfect. Now I'd like to add a widget to be able to display this new widget blueprint to the screen. Let's go back in the editor for a second. Here in the editor, here's our ammo count BP, and this is just a small little widget. We don't really know where we're going to have it on the screen. We want to create a HUD overlay, basically a widget that will have a canvas panel that will fill up the screen so we can position this where we want it. So let's create a new widget blueprint. Let's go back into our HUD folder, right click, user interface, and widget blueprint. And this one's going to be called shooter HUD overlay. And this will basically be an overlay for all the HUD elements we want to show up on the screen, except of course for the crosshairs, which we have shooter HUD BP taking care of that. So double click on shooter HUD overlay. Now we want to keep the canvas panel, and we're going to add an element to this widget blueprint. If we search the palette, we'll see that we can search for ammo count, and here is ammo count BP. We can actually add this onto our canvas panel. So if we click and drag it, we can put it right down here at the bottom of our canvas panel. And we can actually scale this out to where it looks like it's the correct size. Now we can anchor this. We don't have to anchor it to the top left. This is a canvas panel, so we can choose where the anchor will be. I'm going to anchor it to the bottom center. So that way, whatever screen we're on, it will be anchored to the center bottom of this widget blueprint overlay. So now all we need to do is display this shooter HUD overlay to the screen, and we're going to do that from our player controller. So let's go back into Visual Studio. So here in shooter player controller, let's add a private section so we can add some private variables. And the first I'm going to add is a T subclass of. And the T subclass of type is going to be a forward declaration of uUserWidget. That's going to be the type for our widget blueprint. And I'm going to call this HUD overlay class. And if we make this a U property, and if we make this edit anywhere, blueprint read write, then we'll be able to set this from blueprints, and T subclass of will let us select a blueprint based on uUserWidget, and that's what our widget blueprints are based on. So this HUD overlay class is a C++ variable that will hold a blueprint. We'll give this the category of widgets, and we'll give it a meta allow private access equals true specifier. So meta equals parentheses allow private access equals, and of course the text that says true. And now we have our T subclass of variable. So let's give this a comment. The comment is going to say reference to the overall HUD overlay blueprint class. So this gives us a variable that we can populate in blueprints with the widget blueprint. It's basically a variable that holds a blueprint. That's why T subclass of is so useful. And finally, we're going to have a variable of type uUserWidget, and that's a pointer, and we're going to call this HUD overlay. So basically, this HUD overlay class provides us with the blueprint, and we can use a function to create a HUD overlay based on the class that we select in our blueprint for HUD overlay class. Now for our U property, this is what we're going to set in C++ so it'll be visible anywhere. Blueprint read only. And I'll give it the same category and meta specifier. So for this comment, I'm going to say variable to hold the HUD overlay widget after creating it. And we're going to create this in begin play. So I'm going to create a protected section to declare begin play. So it's going to be virtual void begin play, and it's an override. So why don't we go ahead and create the body for begin play. So here in shooter player controller.cpp, I'm going to say void a shooter character. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean a shooter player controller. So used to saying shooter character. This will be begin play. And the first thing we'll do is call super begin play. That way the parent version of begin play will be called. And now we can create our HUD overlay widget based on the blueprint we choose in our T subclass of variable. So let's make a comment and say, check our HUD overlay class T sub class of variable. We're going to check to make sure it's been set in blueprint. So if HUD overlay class, then we know it's been set in blueprints based on the blueprint we choose, that widget blueprint that we choose. And then we can take our HUD overlay, that's the uUserWidget pointer, and we're going to set this equal to the result returned by a function called createWidget. CreateWidget is kind of like spawn actor for actors, only it's used for uUserWidgets. Sorry, no S there, userWidget. Now this takes some parameters, but before we fill that in, I'd like IntelliSense to recognize uUserWidget. So we're going to pull up uUserWidget in Unreal Engine documentation, and here's the include, blueprint/userWidget.h. Let's go ahead and include that here. So now that's recognized. Now we know that createWidget is complaining because it wants some input parameters. Now it's wanting an owner, so we can pass in this since this player controller is the owner of the widget we're creating. And next it says, look, it takes a T subclass of uUserWidget. We just check to make sure our HUD overlay class T subclass of variable is valid, so we can pass that in. So we've chosen a blueprint widget for our T subclass of variable. CreateWidget actually creates an instance based on that blueprint and returns a pointer to it, which we can store in HUD overlay. Once we've created it, we can add it to the viewport. Just after we've created it, let's check it to make sure it's valid if HUD overlay. If it is valid, then let's say HUD overlay and we'll call add to viewport. And we'll go ahead and set its visibility using the set visibility function, which takes an eSlate visibility enum, and we're going to pass in visible. Now let's compile this. Okay, we've compiled. So back here in the editor, we're ready to create a blueprint based on our new player controller. Here in underscore game, let's right click and create a new folder and call this player controller. And we'll stick our player controller right in here. So I'm going to go to C++ classes/shooter, find shooter player controller, and right click and create a blueprint class based on this. And I'll stick it in our player controller folder. And I'm going to call this shooter player controller BP and create blueprint class. Now here is our player controller. Now check it out. Here in the details panel in the widgets section, you'll see that we have a drop down next to HUD overlay class. This is our T subclass of variable. And look, the pop-up tooltip says reference to the overall HUD overlay blueprint class. Check it out. Back here in shooter player controller.h, that is the comment that we gave to our T subclass of variable. It's showing up as our tooltip, which is pretty awesome. I also see a typo here for the comment for HUD overlay. It says variable to hold, but I put holes instead of hold. I'm going to fix that. Okay, back in the editor, I can hover over HUD overlay and see that typo, variable to hold. So that's kind of funny. But anyway, HUD overlay class has a dropdown, and we can choose a widget blueprint for this. And of course, we're going to choose shooter HUD overlay. That's the blueprint widget we created right here, shooter HUD overlay. And just to remind you, it's this canvas panel with our ammo count BP right here at the bottom. So shooter player controller now has a T subclass of variable populated with that blueprint. So now our C++ code that checks for this is going to succeed if we set this player controller to be our default player controller, which is what we're going to do next. So compile and save this and close it. And let's go back to our game mode. So let's go to the game mode folder and open shooter game mode base BP. And here for player controller class, we can select our player controller called shooter player controller BP. Very important, choose the BP version. This is the one that has our T subclass of variable selected. Go ahead, compile and save that. Now one last thing, here in our level, in the world settings, we're going to take a look at our game mode override. Take a look, it says none. This right here will override what we have set in the project settings for every level. So we need to make sure each level has this set to the correct game mode. So let's select this. We'll choose shooter game mode base BP. And now we can see if we open the drop down, all of these are set. Default pawn class is set to shooter character BP. The HUD class is set to shooter HUD BP. Player controller class is set to shooter player controller BP. So you can see all our variables are set now. Perfect. Let's go ahead and save all. And let's go to the play button and hit play. And there we have our widget down here at the bottom, because our player controller is calling create widget to create the widget based on our HUD overlay class variable, which we just set in our player controller blueprint. It's storing that in HUD overlay, and then it's calling add to viewport, and now we can see it, and we make sure that its visibility is set to visible. So back in the editor, we can see it down here, and it's basically just showing these values that are hard-coded in that blueprint. Awesome. So that concludes this video. We've now added functionality to a custom player controller that we created in C++, and we're drawing this HUD to the screen. We're actually drawing the HUD overlay, which draws the entire canvas panel, and it contains this little HUD ammo count widget blueprint inside of it. So in the videos to come, we're going to continue implementing ammunition for our shooter game. So stay tuned. We'll see you in the next video.